I found my late wife's locked wooden box while clearing her craft room. 4 months after we buried her, the locksmith who came to open it took one look inside and said, "Sir, before you touch anything, I think you need to call the police." I asked him why. He stepped back from the workbench, hands raised like he wanted no part of what he'd just seen, and told me he was sorry for my loss. What was inside that box revealed a secret so dangerous that my wife had died to keep it hidden, and now the same people were coming for me. For 3 seasons, that cedar box sat on her craft room shelf, like an ordinary thing. I walked past it every morning on my way to the kitchen. I never thought to open it. I never thought I'd need to. My name is Frank Calloway, and at 64 years old, I thought I understood what my life was. 31 years of marriage. A 4-bedroom house on the eastern shore of Birch Lake in northern Wisconsin. 40 acres of timber and shoreline my grandfather had cleared by hand back when this part of the state was still mostly wilderness. My wife, Margaret, everyone called her Meg, and I had raised 2 children here. Our son, who runs a landscaping company out of Rhinelander, and our daughter, who married into a real estate family in Milwaukee 6 years ago. We had a good, quiet life. The kind of life that doesn't make headlines. Then August came, and everything broke apart. Meg had been the careful one. Careful driver. Careful hiker. Careful about everything she loved. They said she slipped on a wet trail above Copper Falls. One of those freak accidents that the county sheriff's office closes out in 3 weeks with a form and a condolence card. Just one of those things. Frank, trails get slick after rain. I told myself that for 4 months. I cooked for one and slept on one side of the bed and told myself that over and over like a prayer. It was a Tuesday in December when I finally went into her craft room to begin sorting through her things. The space still smelled like her cedar and lavender and the faint mineral scent of watercolor paint. Her unfinished quilt hung on the frame in the corner. Half a cup of colored pencils sat in a mason jar on the windowsill. I was folding fabric into donation boxes when I noticed the cedar chest on the top shelf. Small, maybe the size of a shoebox. With a brass latch and a padlock I didn't recognize. I'd seen it there 100 times without ever wondering about it. Now, suddenly, I couldn't stop wondering. I called Ron Haber, who ran the locksmith shop in town and had been fixing locks in this county for 30 years. He arrived within the hour. It took him 4 minutes to open it. He lifted the lid, glanced inside, and went very still. "Mr. Calloway," he said, using my last name for the first time in the 2 decades I'd known him. "I think you should look at this yourself. And I think you should call someone before you do anything with it." He left shortly after, and I stood alone in my wife's craft room, holding a cedar box that felt heavier than wood and brass had any right to feel. Inside were 2 things. A manila envelope, sealed with tape and labeled in Meg's handwriting for Frank, if something happens to me, and underneath it, a small digital voice recorder, the kind reporters use, with a yellow sticky note attached. The note said one word, "Play." I sat down on the floor of that room with my back against the wall, the way I used to sit when our kids were small and I'd read them stories before bed. I pressed play first. Her voice filled the room. "Frank, if you're hearing this." Then they went through with it. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was trying to protect you. And I was wrong to do that. What I found, what I documented, it's all in the envelope. Don't show it to my brother. Don't trust anyone connected to Hargrove Development. Take the envelope to Thomas Vreeland in Madison. You remember Tom? We went to his wedding. He's still practicing environmental law. Go to him directly. Don't call first. And Frank, I love you. I love you so much. Please don't let them take the lake." The recording clicked off. I sat on that floor for a long time. Then I opened the envelope. Inside were photographs. Not the warm, composed shots Meg took for pleasure, but sharp telephoto images taken from distance and concealment from the tree line above the north shore. From a kayak on the water. From behind the boathouse at the Hendricks property, 2 lots down. The photos showed the wetland basin at the southern edge of our property, the one that fed directly into Birch Lake. Men and waiters, drums being emptied after dark, a backhoe working at the edge of the protected marsh buffer without any visible permits or environmental flags. In 3 of the photographs, standing on the bank in a canvas jacket watching the operation, was my wife's brother. He'd been coming around more since the funeral, always with that soft voice and practiced concern, always mentioning that I looked tired. That 40 acres was too much for one man. That Meg would have wanted me to take things easier. He had brought his business associate twice, a man whose company I now knew was called Hargrove Development. I had been courteous to both of them. I had offered them coffee. Behind the photographs were water test results. Meg had collected samples from the lake inlet across 6 months and sent them to 2 independent labs in different cities. The results were flagged in red: heavy metals, industrial solvents, compounds that didn't belong within 20 miles of a residential lake, let alone a state-designated wetland. On the last page, she had written in her careful schoolteacher handwriting, "This will reach the town water draw-in within 18 months if it continues." Birch Lake fed the municipal water intake for a town of 11,000 people. I put everything back in the cedar box and hid it under the floorboards in the equipment shed, behind the spare tire for the tractor. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly about what I was going to do. 2 days later, my son arrived. I was splitting firewood in the side yard when his truck pulled up the gravel drive. He climbed out wearing the expression I'd come to recognize over the past year, the one that sat somewhere between guilt and urgency, like a man who'd already made a decision and needs you to agree with it before he can feel comfortable. His wife was with him, sitting straight in the passenger seat, with a leather portfolio on her lap. "Dad, we need to talk." They followed me into the kitchen, and I poured coffee. And my son's wife spread papers on the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. The offer was from Hargrove Development, $4.2 million for the 40 acres, the shoreline, and the house, with a 90-day close. My son explained it carefully, the way you explain something to someone you're not sure will understand. He said I could buy a nice place in town. He said Meg would have wanted me to be comfortable. He said 40 acres was a lot of upkeep for a man my age. I was 64 years old. I'd been cutting my own firewood since I was 12. "Who brought this to you?" I asked. My son glanced at his wife. "Your brother-in-law reached out. He said he'd been talking to some people, trying to look out for your interests." "My interests?" I folded my hands on the table. "And what does your brother-in-law get out of this, Dad?" "It's not like that. He's just trying to help. $4 million is a low number for lakefront acreage in this county." I said, "The Whitmore property sold for 6.5 last spring. Half the frontage, half the timber." My son's wife cleared her throat. The market softened. "It hasn't." The conversation ended the way those conversations do, with promises to think about it and vague references to checking back in soon. They stood at the door, and my son put his hand on my shoulder and said he was worried about me living out here alone, that grief could make a person's judgment unreliable, that sometimes we needed help making big decisions when we couldn't see clearly ourselves. His wife had the portfolio tucked under her arm. She didn't look at me when he said it. After their taillights disappeared down the road, I went out to the equipment shed and checked that the box was still there. I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark listening to the ice shift on the lake and thought about my wife standing in the trees with a telephoto lens, collecting evidence for months, without telling me. I thought about the words she'd used on the recording. They, not he, they. The next morning, I found a business card wedged between the seat cushions of the armchair in the living room. My son's wife must have set it there on purpose, or dropped it deliberately where I'd find it. Hargrove Development, LLC, a Milwaukee address, and in small print in the lower corner, a subsidiary name, Clearwater Land Holdings, Wisconsin Division. I searched the name that night on my laptop. I found permitting violations in 3 Wisconsin counties, an EPA notice of investigation from 2 years prior, closed with no action taken, and a corporate officer listing that included, as a registered agent, my wife's brother. The following morning, both my children arrived together. I'd been expecting something, but not this. My daughter had driven up from Milwaukee. 4 hours. Without calling first. She came in without knocking, which she'd never done before. And the way she moved through the house told me she'd been coached. My son was already waiting in the kitchen. They sat across from me at the same table where I'd eaten breakfast with their mother for 31 years. And they told me they were concerned. My son did most of the talking. He said I seemed confused. He said I'd been making accusations about my brother-in-law that weren't fair to a man who was only trying to help. He said the isolation wasn't good for me. That grief affected cognition. That Dr. Marsh in town had agreed to see me for an evaluation. What kind of evaluation, I asked. My daughter opened a folder. Inside was a petition. Already drafted. Already signed by both of them. A petition for guardianship review. They were asking the county court to assess my decision-making capacity. If the evaluation went against me, a court-appointed guardian would take over management of my finances and my property. I looked at my son's signature at the bottom of that page. I looked at my daughter's beside it. They told you that if I sell, your brother-in-law's debts get cleared. I said, I was guessing, but his face told me I wasn't wrong. Dad, how much does he owe them? My daughter stood up and said this was exactly what they were talking about. Conspiracy thinking. Paranoid ideation. She said it the way someone says a phrase they've heard recently. Something that's been put into their mouth and hasn't quite settled into natural speech yet. The evaluation is scheduled for next Thursday. My son said quietly. He couldn't look at me either. Please don't fight this. We're trying to help. They left separately. I watched them go and felt something. I didn't have a clean word for grief. Yes. But beneath it, something colder. The understanding that I was running out of time and that the people who had murdered my wife were now using my own children to finish the job more quietly. I went back to the equipment shed. I took the cedar box. I put it in a waterproof bag inside my spare duffel, buried under a change of clothes and a week's worth of medications. Then I got in my truck and drove south. Madison was 3.5 hours. I took back roads for the first hour, watching my mirrors. Nobody followed me. As far as I could tell, I'd been to Tom Vreeland's wedding 12 years ago. A small ceremony on the shores of Lake Mendota. I hadn't seen him since. He was an environmental attorney now. The kind that spent most of his career fighting cases that made companies uncomfortable and that settled for amounts that never quite covered the damage. I found his office on State Street above a bookstore. A third-floor walk-up with his name on the frosted glass door. He opened the door and stared at me for a long moment. Frank Calloway. He stepped aside to let me in. I was sorry to hear about Meg. I set the cedar box on his desk and said, She left this for you to see. He spent 40 minutes going through everything in silence. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingertips together and looked at the ceiling for a while. This is WDNR jurisdiction, he said finally, but with the federal wetland protections involved, EPA has standing. And this, he tapped the water analysis. Reports this is the kind of documentation that ends careers and starts grand juries. They killed her. I said, The trail. It wasn't an accident. He was quiet again. Copper Falls. I saw the report. Your brother-in-law was one of the witnesses who confirmed the weather conditions. He looked at me steadily. He was on the trail. Something settled into place with a terrible heaviness. What do I do? I asked. Tom leaned forward. First, I'm calling my contact at the EPA regional office. Then I'm calling a journalist I trust at the Wisconsin State Journal. She's been tracking Hargrove development for 8 months, waiting for something solid to break it open. Your wife just handed her everything she needed. He paused. And Frank, they're going to come for you before the week is out. The competency petition is a delay tactic. Once they file that, everything gets complicated. We need to move faster than they're expecting. We put a plan together that afternoon. Tom would contact the EPA and begin the legal groundwork. The journalist, a woman named Claire Sauer who had twice been nominated for state press awards and once been threatened with a lawsuit by a state assemblyman, would come to my property to verify and document, and I would call my brother-in-law. I would tell him I was ready to negotiate. Tom drove up 2 days later with Claire Sauer, a compact woman in her early 40s, with a recorder on the table and questions that cut straight to bone. She went through Meg's photographs for 2 hours. She made calls. She came back into the kitchen and said, "Mr. Calloway, there's an EPA enforcement officer who has been trying to get into this county for 14 months. He's been blocked at the permit level every time. Your wife's documentation is the independent chain of evidence he's been missing." She looked at the recorder on the table. "They'll come if we ask." I called my brother-in-law that evening from my own kitchen phone, standing where Meg used to stand to watch the birds at the feeder. He answered on the second ring, careful and smooth, the way he always was. I told him I'd been thinking about the offer. I told him I was tired. I said maybe they were right. Maybe the land was too much for me, and that I'd like to talk through the numbers one more time before I made a final decision. Could he bring the right people on Saturday evening? I said I wanted to settle this quietly. As a family, he said of course. He said he was glad I'd come around. He said he'd bring his associate from Hargrove and that they'd make sure I was taken care of. I put the phone down and stood looking at the feeder for a long time. On Saturday at 6 p.m, 2 vehicles came up my drive. My brother-in-law's Suburban and a black Escalade I didn't recognize. 3 men walked to my door. My brother-in-law, the man from Hargrove, whose name I finally knew was Gerald Hargrove himself, and a third man I'd never seen compact, watchful, who stood slightly apart from the other 2 and said nothing when we shook hands. I poured coffee and we sat at the table where I'd eaten breakfast with my wife for 31 years. Gerald Hargrove spread the revised offer on the table. $4.6 million now. A small increase designed to feel like a concession. He walked me through the terms with the practiced warmth of a man who had done this many times. Always to people who were tired or grieving or running low on options. "Frank," he said, "this is a generous number. The smart move is to take it. Find yourself somewhere comfortable, and let the land go to its best use." "What use is that?" I asked. "Lakefront development. Mixed residential and commercial. There's real demand here. We're talking about bringing jobs into this community." "Frank, growth. The wetland basin on the south end." I said, "That's a protected buffer under state law." Hargrove's smile didn't change. "There are processes for reclassification. These things move through the regulatory system. The way they've been moving for the past 2 years, I kept my voice level. While your crews dumped industrial waste into the marsh after dark, the room got very quiet. My brother-in-law put his coffee cup down carefully. "Frank, you need to be very careful about what you're saying." My wife was careful. I said, "She documented everything. Photographs, water samples, lab results, corporate filings. She sent duplicates to 3 different locations. She named you in a voice recording." I looked at him directly. "She was careful all the way up until you walked up that trail behind her at Copper Falls." His face didn't give me the confession I needed. Not yet. But Hargrove shifted in his chair, and the silent man near the window moved slightly. And that was enough to tell me I was right about all of it. "Frank." Hargrove's voice had changed. "The warmth gone. Whatever you think you've found. You need to understand the situation you're in. You're an elderly man living alone. There's already a legal proceeding questioning your competency. You have no credibility. You have no allies. You have a piece of land that we are going to acquire one way or another. Because that's how these things work. Now, I'm offering you an exit that protects you. I'd take it. And if I don't," he leaned forward, "then things get more difficult. Estates are complicated. Elderly people have accidents. You know how it is up here in winter. Frank, ice on the dock, slippery steps, frozen lake. A man your age, living alone. One bad morning and nobody finds him until spring. You're threatening me. I'm describing reality. Your wife didn't understand that. She thought documentation would protect her. He glanced at my brother-in-law. It didn't. And there it was. My wife is the reason you're done. I said. Claire Sauer stepped in from the hallway. Tom Vreeland followed her. Behind them, through the front window, I could see headlights on the road. The EPA enforcement team Tom had coordinated, parked at the edge of the property since 4 o'clock. Hargrove stood up so fast, his chair scraped back. What is this, Claire Sauer? Wisconsin State Journal. Claire said. Her recorder held steady. That statement just went live to my editor's queue. Mr. Calloway, would you like to clarify what Mr. Hargrove just said about your wife? My brother-in-law moved toward the back door and found Tom standing in the hallway. I'd stay at the table, Tom said. The knock at the front door came 2 minutes later. State DNR enforcement and 2 EPA special agents, credentials in hand. The silent man by the window turned out to be a Hargrove attorney, and he began talking immediately, which Tom told me later was always a sign that the case was solid. They took all 3 of them out through the front door in handcuffs. Gerald Hargrove walked with his head up, arrogance still intact, even at that moment. The kind of man so accustomed to getting away with things that he hadn't yet processed that this time he hadn't. My brother-in-law walked with his head down. He didn't look at me. I stood on my porch in the cold December air and watched until the vehicle lights disappeared down the road. The lake was dark and frozen and perfectly still. Claire's story ran the following Monday morning. By noon it had been picked up by the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and the Associated Press. By Tuesday, the Wisconsin Attorney General's office had announced an investigation. By Thursday, the EPA had issued an emergency enforcement order and sealed the wetland basin as an active contamination site. Federal charges followed within the week: environmental crimes, conspiracy, and a separate criminal investigation into Meg's death at Copper Falls, which the State Division of Criminal Investigation had quietly reopened 2 days after the EPA filing. I was feeding the wood stove on a Thursday morning when my phone rang. It was Tom. Frank, the Dane County DA, just called me. The third man from your kitchen, Hargrove's attorney. He's been negotiating since Monday. He has documentation of your brother-in-law on the trail. He has communication records. He wants to testify. Pause. They're going to charge him with second-degree homicide. I sat down in Meg's chair by the window and looked out at the lake for a long time. The competency petition was withdrawn by my son the same day the criminal charges were announced. He called me 3 times before I answered. When I finally picked up, he didn't say anything for a while. And then he said, Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what they were using me for. I thought it was just about the land. His voice broke at the end of it. I didn't know about Mom. My daughter called from Milwaukee. She'd left her husband the week prior, moved in with a college friend, and she called me from a gas station somewhere on Highway 41 with a shaky voice and said she needed to come home. I told her to drive carefully and that I'd have dinner ready. It took a long time for things to settle. These things do. The criminal case moved through its process over the following year. Federal environmental charges layered over the state criminal investigation. Plea agreements and trial dates and the grinding machinery of courts that rarely move quickly. Hargrove received 12 years on the federal environmental charges, with additional state charges pending. My brother-in-law, after a trial that lasted 11 days and drew reporters from 3 states, received a sentence that will keep him in Waupun Correctional until he is an old man. The wetland remediation began in late spring. Environmental crews worked through the summer months, and I watched from the shoreline sometimes, the way Meg used to watch the herons at dawn quietly, not wanting to disturb the work. The lead remediation officer told me it would take 2 to 3 years to fully restore the basin. He said the water draw-in for the town had been tested and was still safe. That the contamination hadn't reached it yet. He said we'd gotten there in time. Meg had gotten us there in time. My son lost the landscaping company. The financial entanglements with Hargrove had gone deeper than I knew, and the legal fallout required years to untangle. He came back to the lake property that spring and worked with me through the season. We didn't talk about it every day. Some mornings we just cut wood or cleared brush along the north fence line, side by side in the cold, and let the silence do what silence does, when people are trying to find their way back to each other. He got up early and made coffee. He fixed the dock planks that had been rotting since October. He was trying, and trying was enough to start with. My daughter stayed through the winter. She took a remote job, set up her laptop in the guest room, and by March was making maple syrup with a neighbor's family down the road, like she'd never lived anywhere else. One evening she asked me to teach her how to read the soil test results from the remediation crew's monthly reports, and I watched her bent over the paperwork at the kitchen table with a yellow highlighter and felt something shift back toward whole. In May, when the ice had been off the lake for 3 weeks, we planted a garden along the south-facing slope above the water, in the patch of sun that Meg had always said was wasted on grass. Perennials. Mostly black-eyed Susans, wild bergamot, prairie coneflower, the things she'd always said she'd get around to someday. My granddaughter, who was 6 and had her grandmother's habit of asking questions before she knew what to do with the answers, helped press seeds into the earth with her small thumb and wanted to know if the flowers would grow back next year too. Every spring. I told her, they come back every spring. I walked down to the water's edge that evening after the kids had gone inside. The light was low and gold across the lake, the kind of light that appears for about 20 minutes this time of year before the woods swallow it. A great blue heron stood at the inlet, perfectly still, watching something beneath the surface with absolute patience. Meg used to bring her camera here. I talked to her the way I'd gotten into the habit of talking to her since August, quietly, without expecting an answer. The way you talk to someone you love when you know they can't respond, but you believe somehow that the words carry anyway. I told her the water was coming clean. I told her the fish were back in the inlet, the frogs back in the restored marsh, that I'd heard geese in the basin for the first time in 2 years. I told her that her children were here, that they were learning to be something other than afraid. I told her that the cedar box was in the equipment shed again, on the same shelf where it had always been, locked, this time with a key. I kept on my keychain alongside the truck key and the house key and the small brass key to her mother's old jewelry box that had been on that ring for as long as I could remember. I told her I was still angry. I told her I understood why she hadn't wanted to frighten me, and I understood it had been a way of protecting the people she loved, and I was still angry about it. I told her I thought she had been the bravest person I'd ever known, and that I needed her to know that. The heron lifted from the water without a sound and crossed the inlet toward the far shore, wide wings pulling it slowly up and over the trees until it was gone. I walked back up to the house. My son had lit the fire. My daughter was finishing dinner. My granddaughter was drawing pictures at the coffee table with the concentration of someone doing very important work. The lake was cleaned. The family was healing. The land would stay. Meg had made sure of all 3 things. Even when it cost her everything, the least I could do was live the rest of my life making sure it held. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight for something important when everyone around you doubted what you knew was true? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, please subscribe and pass it along to someone who needs a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when it matters most. We'll be right here when you need us.